manteniendo en silencio sus celulares. El evento está a punto de empezar, por lo que les pedimos a todos tomar sus lugares. Sin más preámbulo, cedo la palabra a Mariana Campero, directora general del Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales.
Gracias, Maite. Hola, buenos días a todos y bienvenidos. Por cortesía con nuestro invitado, conduciremos este panel en inglés. Good morning and welcome. I am Mariana Campero, Director of COMEXI, the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. And COMEXI is a non-profit independent organization dedicated to the analysis, study, and debate of the major global trends, but especially on those affecting Mexico. And very few subjects have impacted Mexico more than trade, particularly the renegotiation of NAFTA, the imposition of tariffs on aluminum and steel, which have yet to be lifted, by the way, and the uncertainty that is still floating around the ratification of the new of USMCA with a new Democratic Congress. And on a global basis, we are seeing a major battle between the United States and China, not only over trade and tariffs, but more profoundly about a technological race to the top. We are also seeing a threat to a rules-based system as we know it, and the United States has yet to nominate the new judges for the WTO. Today, we have the privilege to welcome two world-class experts and direct participants in these battles. First, let me introduce to you Nick Sowar, leader of the global metal sector at Deloitte. Nick has over 35 years of experience on the steel industry and has advised top global companies on these issues as well as on manufacturing issues. Second, Juan Carlos Baker, a friend and member of COMEXI, but more importantly, Undersecretary of International Trade and a key player in the renegotiation of the USMCA, the CTPP, the European Agreement, among many others.
Thank you.
And Jude Webber, who will be moderating this conversation. She's a renowned journalist, the Mexico and Central America correspondent for the Financial Times, and she has written extensively about these issues. The agenda today will consist of an initial presentation by Mr. Sowar of approximately 15 minutes, followed by another one by Juan Carlos Baker, and after that, Jude will be handling the conversation. Immediately after that, we will open the floor for your questions. Thank you very, very much for being here. And before I pass the microphone to Nick, I want to thank Carlos Moya and Manuel Nieblas, partners of Deloitte, who have graciously lent us this space. They're a member and a friend of COMEXI, so thank you very much. With that, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's certainly a privilege to be here. As global metals leader for Deloitte, we're proud of our involvement and support of the global steel industry. Today, I will discuss a provocative and controversial topic: the disruption of the Mexico-United States trade relative to the aluminum and steel tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. I will discuss the current effects of the U.S.-Mexico trade policy changes, its effects on the Mexican steel industry, alternatives, and thoughts on the future. First, I'd like to provide my thoughts on the reason for the U.S. metal tariffs. It's somewhat of a misnomer, in my mind, to call these tariffs Trump tariffs. In my mind, such tariffs are Wilbur Ross's. As background, about 15 years ago, Mr. Ross assembled the International Steel Group by acquiring iconic American steel companies out of bankruptcy. He was familiar with steel companies in the United States going bankrupt. These companies included the iconic Bethlehem Steel and LTV Steel and many others. Subsequently, I led the financial due diligence for for Middle Steel during its acquisition of this group that was controlled by Mr. Ross. I interacted with Mr. Ross during this acquisition and subsequently when he was on the board and audit committee of ArcelorMittal. Mr. Ross is an extremely smart man. He served as a board member of ArcelorMittal for over 10 years. That gave him the feel for the entire global steel industry, plus his experience at ISG with the US steel industry. He understands what's happening. Fast forward to today. Mr. Ross is now Secretary of Commerce for the United States and initiated action regarding trade imbalances. The underlying basis for most of the US trade tariffs are to address the unfair trade policies and practices of China. The overall tariffs imposed by the US on most imports from China are Section 301 tariffs, used against countries that make unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory trade actions. But for all steel and aluminum imports, tariffs were assessed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Think about that date. That's when President Kennedy's in and the Cold War was at its height. That act gives the president broad authority to restrict imports in the interest of national security relating to the US military. National security of today's US military is the primary concern of the Trump administration relative to steel and aluminum. We can debate this, we can say, that's not true. But I'll ask the question, does the US need a strong military defense organization? I think many countries believe this, that the US certainly needs a strong military, and they're depending upon the US military. You could ask such countries like people from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Ukraine, Israel, and Europe, even if Europe doesn't believe it. I'll ask you the question, to build an Abrams tank, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, or a Virginia-class nuclear submarine, where will the US military obtain the steel? From China? From Russia? I don't think so. Same is true for aluminum for jet aircrafts. Again, we can debate this, but the US government has concluded that viable US steel and aluminum industries are critical for the US national defense and as a deterrent to nefarious forces throughout the world. Mexican steel imports are heavily dependent on the US, which accounts for about 60% of the Mexican steel exports by volume. In June 2018, the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on steel imports, resulting in the Mexican steel industry losing its cost competitiveness in the US. Since these tariffs were imposed, Mexican steel production decreased by 2.9%, compounded monthly rate of change, while the US production increased by 1%. These percentages may seem minor, but the annual effects are dramatic. In June 2018 alone, Mexican steel exports to the US decreased 37.4% compared to the previous month. During the June to August 2018 period, Mexican steel exports to the US decreased by 30%. Bottom line, the negative effects of the tariffs on the Mexican steel production and exports to the United States are substantial. I have a few additional comments and observations regarding the overall purpose of effective tariffs. Tariffs are extremely challenging to the countries where the tariffs are imposed, like Mexico. You're feeling it. But also in the home country, like the US, because they result in price increases in that country that imposes those tariffs. And buyers of such steel will protest these tariffs and are protesting the tariffs. Ford Motor Company is an example of said response. And these protests by buyers will continue and in my mind will get louder. As a side note, with the recent changes in Congress, there's actions trying to be taken to reduce the president's power to enact Section 232 tariffs. This is an important point to me. I believe firmly for the steel tariffs to be effective, and I'm not talking about just Mexico, I'm talking about what the United States has imposed. For steel tariffs to be effective, structural changes need to be made to the U.S. steel industry imposed during this 232 tariffs time frame. If not, then this will only be a short-term solution that won't guarantee the long-term viability of the U.S. steel industry. But tariffs do have a valuable purpose: to force changes to trade policies. In my mind, there's a big difference between free trade and fair trade. The playing field for all steel producers needs to be level. When steel is sold below cost as a policy, that policy is broken and harmful to all other producers. Currently, we have that policy in China. Remember that over 60% of the global steel capacity is directly or indirectly controlled by state-owned entities. The playing field is not level as it stands today. I believe strongly that tariffs are not protectionism, but I also believe strongly that tariffs without negotiations to change trade policies are protectionism. Regarding quotas, they're probably the lesser of two evils, but they can still punish the buyers with higher prices. Further, they're extremely burdensome on the regulators to monitor the quotas. And then we have the unintended consequences from the steel tariffs that need to be addressed. The best example of the unintended consequences is Mid-Continent Steel and Wire based in Poplar Bluffs, Missouri. Since Diacero's acquisition of this company in 2012, Diacero has invested millions of dollars in this facility, doubling its size and creating valuable new jobs in the United States. But its semi-finished steel, used in the production of nails in Poplar Bluffs, is imported from Diacero in Mexico, resulting in the 25% tariff destroying the entire efficient and effective operating model and supply chain that Diacero put in place. These imports of semi-finished steel need to be excluded from the tariffs. Unfortunately, the exclusion process itself also needs to be fixed because Mid-Continent filed an exclusion request over 230 days ago with the United States Department of Commerce and has yet to hear anything. Clearly, Section 232 was not put in place to harm companies like Mid-Continent. Hopefully, the new U.S.-Mexico trade agreement will provide relief to Mid-Continent and Diacero because it needs to address these steel tariffs. Now, this depiction of the effects of the tariffs is even more dramatic. You can see that prior to the tariffs, the spread between the U.S. steel prices compared to the world prices was about $100 a ton. After the tariffs, that spread is more than double. Now let's look at the macroeconomic effects of the tariffs on the Mexican economy. Immediately after the tariff announcement in June, the peso fell to a 15-month low while the CPI increased. But these negative changes seem to be temporary. And they should be temporary, given that only $3 billion of the Mexican steel exports are sent to the U.S., which is a small fraction of $300 billion of total Mexican exports to the U.S. During 2018, Mexican steel demand was reduced due to the uncertainty surrounding NAFTA and the Mexican presidential elections. Because of this, coupled with the tariffs, both steel production and steel producers' profitability were reduced in Mexico significantly. But I believe the overall outlook for Mexican steel is positive moving forward. The proposed initiatives by the new president should bode well for the steel producers. And I believe this is the most critical point. The Mexican steel producers are competent, are efficient, and are building world-class facilities and can stand on their own. Further, the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement can help refoster the import-export relationship, but it needs to address the steel and aluminum tariffs relative to Mexico and Canada. Recent publications are upbeat on the Mexican steel industry and the manufacturing sector in general. Quotes include steel demand to pick up pace in 2019, steel demand to be revived in 2019, automotive segment to fuel steel demand, and construction segment to witness demand growth. The key users of the Mexican steel continue to be solid performers, and the Mexican GDP is forecasted to exceed 2.5% annually through 2023. To sum up, the tariff challenges, in my mind, are being overcome by the Mexican steel producers and the Mexican economy in general. And there is and should be optimism regarding the Mexican steel industry and its producers. This industry is resilient and ever adaptive, and is proving that today. AMSA, Ternium, and ArcelorMittal are building new facilities to supply the automotive sector as Mexico continues to move up the value chain. These investments are not being deterred by the tariffs and are continuing to be made and will enhance the overall capabilities of the Mexican steel industry to provide value-added products, particularly to the automotive industry. However, an offsetting factor that will increase the competition in Mexico-U.S. steel environment are the further investments in new capacity and restarts of previously closed mills in the United States. Steel Dynamics has announced plans to open a new flat mill in the South. I understand it's going to be in southern Texas. Nucor continues to build and expand its rebar facilities, and the U.S. Steel and Republic Steel have restarted or plan to restart shuttered mills. All this new capacity will put additional pressure on both Mexican and U.S. steel producers. Now let's look to the future and potential actions. There are two approaches to dealing with tariffs. Number one, take action with the implementer of the tariffs via negotiations or counter tariffs. Number two, initiate actions to increase activity with other markets. Said another way, find new markets. Regarding the first action, Mexico is working with the United States with the new North American trade agreement, but the tariff removal has not occurred. So Mexico has implemented countermeasures to address the steel tariffs, primarily through retaliatory tariffs on certain high value and highly consumed U.S. goods, including pork, potatoes, whiskey, and dairy products. But there is a risk to these retaliatory tariffs. One, the risk of rising prices and supply shortage in Mexico for these products, and two, it might attract further tariffs from the U.S. Again, hopefully, agreement can be reached via some sort of quota system or through the new U.S.-Mexico trade agreement to address these tariffs. The other option for the Mexican steel producers is to expand their trade with non-U.S. countries, and there continues to be opportunities for high value-added Mexican automotive steel around the world. Moreover, there's been a rising steel demand in various regions of the world that would be an opportunity for Mexican steel producers. But there's challenges there, and there's much irony in this whole situation. In October, Canada imposed what it refers to as a 25% safeguard duties on all imported steel to Canada for a 200-day effective period. And I understand why they would do that, because they don't want to be the dumping ground. And that's exactly what the United Steelworkers National Director in Canada stated, that such duties needed to counter the incentive to divert US-bound foreign steel into Canada. The Canadian director stated, and I quote, think about these words, "We must rigorously defend our steel industry from a glut of foreign steel." But in the same breath, he demands the removal of Section 232 tariffs, saying they're unfair. So essentially he's saying, well, I have no problem with cheap foreign imports destroying the U.S. steel industry, we just don't want it to destroy Canada's. See, that amazes me. In addition, the EU has also taken action relative to the steel industry in an attempt to protect the region's market from steel redirected from the United States. So notwithstanding the EU's protest of the U.S. steel tariffs, it too has taken action to stop unfair steel trade. The EU has implemented trade tariff quotas on 23 steel product categories based on average import volume in recent years. Also, country-specific quotas have been enacted. Further, other quotas will be set quarterly. All these measures will be effective until July of 2021. As a result of the actions of the Canadian and EU regulators, similar to the US tariffs, these regions are trying to stop unfair trade. Ultimately, unfair trade policies, particularly China's, will have to change. As I stated earlier, tariffs do have a valuable purpose: to force changes to trade policies. We really can't have a discussion regarding steel imports and the catalyst for the disruption of the balance of trade in the global steel market without discussing China. China and its state-owned steel companies are the root cause of the excess global steel capacity and the dumping of steel on a global basis. China continues to account for over half of the global steel production, with 928 million tons produced in 2018, with many of those tons being dumped in the global market. The lack of production discipline in the Chinese steel industry is due to two reasons. First, the Chinese steel industry is extremely fragmented, with over 400 steelmakers. And second, of these state-owned entities, only a handful are controlled by the central government. The clear majority of these steel companies are controlled by the provinces. Although the central government has stressed consolidation and rationalization and has stressed this for years, the province's goal is fixed on one thing: employment. As a result, mill closings or inter-province mergers are simply non-starters for the provinces. In 2017, the top 10 steel producers in China made less than 40% of the steel. The goal by 2020 is the top 10 producers to make 60% of the steel. But that's been a goal for years. They've talked about that for years, and it hasn't happened. Nor will it happen if the Chinese provinces continue to have their way. Now, there is some positive news that although the steel exports remain high in absolute terms, they have decreased over the last 2 years. In 2016, China exported 107 million tons of steel. That's about the size of the entire Japanese steel industry. Those exports decreased to 75 million in 2017 and are expected, when the final numbers come in, to be even lower in 2018. So as previously mentioned, the Chinese central government is and has been attempting to eliminate excess steel capacity. It's been effective in eliminating illegal induction furnace production. Further, of the few steel companies that the central government does own, it led by example with consolidation and rationalization by combining two of those steel companies, Bao Steel and Wuhan, to form the second largest steel company in the world with the creation of Baowu. I applaud the efforts of the central government in its attempt to rein in the overcapacity of the steel industry, if only the provinces would follow. The good news regarding the issue with excessive Chinese steel imports is that very few have entered Mexico, particularly after Mexico imposed anti-dumping duties on certain Chinese goods. But those have been rescinded. As I previously mentioned, Mexico should try to grow its steel presence throughout the rest of the world. And this is where the challenge is. China has substantially increased its steel exports to Asia, India, and the EU. In fact, India has essentially become the dumping ground for excess Chinese steel. Thus, some of the opportunities Mexican steel producers may have are being narrowed by the Chinese exports to these global markets. In conclusion, I believe firmly that notwithstanding the 232 tariffs, the Mexican steel industry will prosper in 2019, and let's hope for several other outcomes. One, that China will adjust its trade policies to cease the unfair practice of dumping steel on a global basis. To that end, China needs to eliminate its excess capacity. To eliminate the need to dump steel, there's got to be 200 to 400 million excess tons of capacity in China. Until then, I believe firmly that Mexico should follow the United States and Canada and establish 25% tariffs to match those. There's a three partnership here with United States, Canada, and Mexico, and I believe they should all follow suit so that they are not being the dumping ground. The second thing, that unintended consequences facing Diacero with its nail facility in Missouri will be rectified. And finally, that Section 232 tariffs are addressed ultimately in some sort of final agreement among the U.S., Mexico, and Canada trade agreement. Thank you.
For Comexi, Mariana, to make the invitation and to make the space for me. Also, thanks to our host, Deloitte, always happy to be here. Looking forward to continue this engagement. My fellow co-panelist, Jude, Nick, thanks for also devoting time to this. I should probably start by saying that we are not seeing something unique in the history of trade. The reality is that trade, what we are now referring to as trade wars, have happened in the past, and very likely they are going to happen again. Right now, obviously, we are, as Nick so eloquently put it, we are seeing how in the real world, the effects on certain commodities as steel and aluminum are a reflection of the tensions that are occurring at a larger level regarding trade policy, regarding integration, and why not say it openly regarding some questionings about the model of trade that we have followed for the past few decades. China certainly is one of the key actors that have come to put this model into question, but it is not the only country. So if we look back at the history of trade, we can see in the early 1990s a trade war between the US and the European Union. In that occasion back then, it was about bananas. I'm not kidding. That was really the reason why the US and the European Union started slapping tariffs on each other. If we go back even further into the distance, the early 1990s, it was about Japan and the US. And at that moment, it was about cars, it was about semiconductors. It was the moment when that, and I love the expression, the voluntary export restrictions, that they hardly were voluntary at all. But at that moment, it was when the concept was invented. If we look back even further into time, 1920s, we can see that as far back as that presidential election, President Hoover, who also had a role in the Department of Commerce. He was a Secretary of Commerce previously, before being elected president in the United States. He campaigned on some arguments for raising tariffs on agricultural commodities, which afterwards led to the Smoot-Hawley legislation that increased tariffs in the U.S. imports of close to 60-70%, which also at that moment led to the retaliatory action of many countries, including Mexico, by the way, which also, some scholars argue, had something to do with the subsequent military consequences of such a polarized world back in the 1920s, early 30s. So the point that I'm trying to make to you today, this morning, is that certainly what we're seeing today is different for a number of reasons that I will get into that. But the reality is that trade wars have always existed, and they reflect basic misconceptions of the trade system at that particular moment, and it also reflects the realities of the political world and the interest of several countries that participate at that particular moment. But this time is different. I see some factors that didn't exist in any of those occasions that I previously mentioned for you. The first one, and probably is the most obvious one, is that back then the World Trade Organization didn't exist. So when we see how, in the 1980s, Japan and the US engaged in these discussions, there was no forum for them to take those concerns and being addressed. And even in previous occasions, it was even different. No? This time around, the fact that the US and China are having this engagement, and the discussions just actually ended very early this morning in Beijing between Ambassador Lighthizer and Vice Prime Minister Liu He. They are set to meet again next week in Washington, which only tells you how exhausted these discussions are being conducted. Next week will be the third week in a row that the negotiators meet. But the fact that we are witnessing this discussion between China and the US, and the WTO is silently standing on side, is also very telling. Are we seeing that the WTO, as part of these tensions in the world, becomes less relevant? Well, that's probably one of the things that we also should be worrying about in having as a collateral damage of this trade war, inadvertently weakening the international trading system, of which Mexico is a key part. So that's one of the elements that makes different this trade war. The second is the spread of contagion. Previously, whether we are referring to the 1980s or other examples, the fact that the global value chains were not so integrated as they are right now, the fact that fewer countries participated in a substantial part in the international trade scene, made those trade wars more isolated, and those consequences, the consequences of those wars, less obvious as what we are witnessing right now. There was this report by the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade Development, that you may have seen about 2 weeks ago, where the UNCTAD estimated that the disruption of the value chains in a full-fledged trade war could amount to as much as $160 billion. So that we know how much we're talking about, Mexico exports roughly $400 billion a year. So the effect of this particular event in the global value chains has the potential to affect half of Mexico's exports. So that's really how we should dimension all of this. Trade wars have happened in the past. They will likely continue to happen. This one is different for several ideas or several factors that were not present in the past. But the consequences, the current consequences, are just as important and or have the potential to be as devastating as the ones that occurred before. So the key question at this moment becomes, what do we do? How do we address all of this? And perhaps even more, a more basic question, can we do something? Can other countries, other than the two major ones that we are referring, China and the US namely, can other countries do something? And I will probably put forward in that point 3 basic suggestions or 3 ideas. One of them is that, yes, countries, all of them, whether or not they are at the front and center of this trade war right now, they have a stake on making sure that we have a good outcome out of this. What a good outcome is obviously remains to be defined, but there must be a solution out of this, because the possibility of engaging on a very prolonged trade war is just something that we should be really very scared about. So as much as other countries, and Mexico being one of the middle grounders in the world, including others, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, New Zealand, Singapore, we all have a stake in making sure that in the WTO, particularly on steel, which is also one of the topics of this morning's talks, there is a group, a particularly specially crafted group in the OECD that has the mandate to deal with the reasons for the overcapacity on steel, and Mexico has been participating in that group for the past few years. So yes, countries need to engage. Point number 2 on what we do. We negotiate. If, as Nick was saying earlier, many of the reasons of why this situation has come to our doorstep spring from the fact that the trade book has no rules to deal with state-owned enterprises, to deal with the massive use of sub-federal subsidies and other practices that should not be happening. If we are unable to find ways to make sure that countries comply with their commitments regarding notification, verification, and other activities, well, then we all should go back and review the playbook and review the rules that are applicable to that. And that becomes a very tricky, a very complicated, a very challenging task when we have so many countries now participating in world trade. But giving up on that possibility of rewriting the trade book is certainly something that we should not consider. Now, the third thing that we should do is that as much as those policies, Section 232 on the United States, but also other actions that other countries, including Mexico, have taken, I understand that those are reactions to other actions that happened before, sorry to repeat myself, but we need to make sure that those actions are kept in check. Because otherwise, it is really a slippery slope. And I know that it sounds very tempting, and it might it might resonate very well in some sectors, but if country X establishes 10% and then we establish 20% and then country X is going to go back with 40% and we're going to come back to 60, and you get the point of where I'm going. And unfortunately, there are only a few countries that really have that, whose the size of their economies, the size and the participation of those countries in trade can really sustain such a process on the long run. Smaller countries certainly are not able to keep on that escalating action of tariffs. So we need to keep those actions in check. I understand that some of them certainly need to be taken in response to other actions, but as much as we continue down that slope is really going to be something that is not good for anyone. What is the scenario right now? What do we do? Or what can we expect? Certainly, politics are not necessarily on our side, on trade side. As you know, the United States is going to engage shortly in a political campaign to re-elect. President Trump certainly wants to get re-elected, and the Democratic Party certainly wants to avoid that. There will also be elections in Europe this year for the European Parliament. There are some key countries as well that are going to be involved in elections. So elections and trade certainly are two topics that do not necessarily get along very well. So I expect that if there is no evident or there's no apparent way out of this cul-de-sac between China and the US, we are going to be seeing trade taking up a larger role in the political campaigns in the months to come. Also, I think, and this is certainly not something that we should take comfort in, but the fact that there is so much trade disruption going on between the US and China does create a few opportunities. In that same report that I mentioned to you, released by the UNCTAD, there was a very colorful scale on which are the countries that benefit the most from this present situation. The EU stood to gain the most, but the second country that was to gain the most on this was precisely Mexico, with potentially increasing our exports up to $27 billion, which again is not small. It's not a small figure. It's close to the whole size of our agricultural exports to the world. So that's how much we could gain in an additional exports because of this. But again, it's no consolation, because as I'm saying, those short-term wins that we may find by supplying or by filling up those pockets of supply that were left absent Chinese supply certainly are going to be offset in the long run if we continue to increase tariffs. So I think as well that, well, on the politics, as I'm saying, I think that trade is going to continue to be a hot topic, so to speak, in the political debates forward. I also think that those pockets of supply are going to be fulfilled by someone. And Mexico certainly stands in a good position to benefit for the wrong reasons, but to benefit because of this situation. Thirdly, I also think that we can expect to see a much robust debate in the WTO about a key concept that Nick also alluded to earlier that has to do with national security. National security certainly is something that the WTO and previously the GATT, the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, provided for. But it has very seldom being used. Right now, because of the use of the Section 232 by the United States, a few countries are challenging in the WTO, including China, of course, the use and the interpretation of Section 232. Now, leaving aside whether or not the trade law in the US or the Ley de Comercio Exterior in Mexico are going to be changed anytime soon, what we are about to see is perhaps the most comprehensive and deep discussion regarding trade policy that has taken place in decades, because no one has really, in the past, tried to address what national security means. Because an extreme interpretation of what national security means is basically, well, everything, no? You can just ban the import of balloons if you want, because children are going to get hurt by them. I'm being absurd to make the point that really, once that we start that discussion, we're going to see the boundaries where the new interpretation of national security can be understood in the 21st century, no? And again, the small parenthesis, and I won't really delay too much on this. I understand what the Section 232 in the United States is intending to do, but I categorically have to reject that Mexico, or Canada for that matter, represent any threat whatsoever to the US national security. If the whole reason for having tariffs on imports is to maintain the ability of the said country to provide steel, and if importing steel from other places threatens such national security, well, let's just go back to the numbers and we will find out that actually in steel and aluminum trade, Mexico has the deficit and the US has the surplus. So it's hard for me to understand where the threat to the national security fits in. But anyway, it's certainly a topic that deems much more time than what we have right now, and whose political consequences, regional consequences, certainly are larger. No? I will conclude just by trying to tie up everything. Trade wars have happened in the past. They will very likely continue to happen because those trade wars are reflections of the distortion, the disruption in trade patterns. They also reflect the particular politics and the understanding of trade policy in any particular point in time. And obviously, likely that's very dynamic and it's going to change. Second, this time around, it's different because we have more players. We have a rule book that hasn't been updated in a while. And because some countries deliberately engage in practices that threaten the whole system. And I'm not referring to anyone in particular. Obviously, China always comes up as a big challenge to the international trading system. But behind China, there could be many others, including other racing powers whose interests might not lie on steel, but nonetheless also will gladly take up the similar approach in other commodities. No, we certainly have a stake in keeping the system together, and for keeping the system together, that means that the US and China need to find a way out of the situation that they have put themselves into. There might be some short-term positive benefits on this, but those are very likely to be offset if this war prolongs for too much. And lastly, we are about to see a discussion on the WTO that is very relevant to the future of the international trade system, and hopefully that discussion goes well, because otherwise I think that the international trading system could be in a very difficult position, to say the least. No? What's Mexico doing? Mexico is participating in each and every one of these fronts. Mexico not only renegotiated the USMCA, its agreement with the US and Canada, to make it fit these new conditions. We also participated actively, I must say, on the TPP discussions. We concluded our negotiations with Europe, likewise, but that never distracted Mexico to keep its participation in this forum for steel and the OECD that I mentioned to you, in the WTO. Mexico's ambassador to WTO, Ambassador Roberto Zapata, is the chair of the rules group in the WTO and is doing a magnificent work to keep the system together. And likewise, we are also forging these alliances with other countries, trying to make sure that those protectionist measures really are kept in check, and we no longer see an escalation on this. There's this, no pun intended, I'm sorry, but there's this Chinese old saying that claims that the best that one person can aspire to is to live in very interesting times. So if that is the case, for those of us that are trade geeks, certainly we are living in very fascinating times. Thank you very much. Do you want to stand, or do you want me to get you the mic? Oh, you have a mic, right?
I'm mic'd up.
Yeah, well, are you mic'd up?
I have a mic.
Excellent. All right, well, look, thank you both, Nick, Juan Carlos. Very, very interesting, very stimulating, very provocative as well. Let's just start off by being clear then, Nick. Are you in favor of or against these measures? You seem to be standing sort of slightly in the middle.
Talking the 232 steel?
Yeah.
I am in favor of the 232 steel because having spent time, there's some troubled steel companies in the United States, a couple big ones, and I believe strongly that in light of, I had an uncle that flew off the Enterprise aircraft carrier in World War II, and I had an uncle who fought at Guadalcanal. My dad was in the Korean War. I want those military people to be protected in the best way possible. Steel is a basic component of so many things. And if we can sit and say, well, U.S. really doesn't need that. I believe we do. We can debate that, but there's a real fundamental issue. Having looked at the financials and have dealt with these steel companies over the years, I know how tough it is. Somebody asked me recently, well, Nick, do we provide any tax services at U.S. Steel? I said no, because they haven't paid federal taxes in over 10 years, because it's all they do is lose money. So that's where I am on that. Where I am on Canada is I understand that if indeed we have a partnership with the three countries and they want to put a 25% in, I understand they're not looking for whoever dumped it to U.S., they're going to try to dump it to Canada. We want to stop that. That makes sense to me. And it also makes sense to me if Mexico did the same thing, that this partnership is going to stand together. But I don't appreciate Canada criticizing the United States for what they're doing, and then they go do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I think the question there is, do we have a partnership then? So the USMCA deal that you were negotiating and successfully got away, with all the headwinds, has not been ratified yet, and faces problems. How do you see this ratification process and the threats that could bring?
Certainly, Just piggybacking a little bit on what Nick's saying, I certainly think that the way that the world now really competes is not by individual countries, but rather by regions. If you see, Europe has certainly its center on well, it used to be Germany, France, and the UK. It will shortly be just Germany and France. But nonetheless, the rest of the countries group around that. The same happens in Asia, whether it's China or Japan. We can still debate it, but there's a regional basis that serves us, as a gathering point for the rest of the countries. And I think that in North America, we're just the same. So yes, I would argue that we do have a partnership. That doesn't necessarily mean that we see eye to eye on every topic all the time. But our policies for the past 3 decades have really more or less been coordinated and convergent, but certainly that is something that these actions, and again, I keep coming back to the politics of them, certainly if we are able to overcome them, I think that it will be certainly something very good for North America, and it will cement even further that partnership. Now, in terms of the other part of your question, Jude, the ratification process for the USMCA. Well, I think that In Mexico, we know it's only the upper house, the Senate, the one that really takes a vote on that. We started with the hearings. The hearings for the ratification started even before the agreement was actually signed. So that tells you the importance that the political actors in Mexico attach to this issue. So I certainly don't see any problems going further. There will be certainly a debate. There will be some topics that are going to carry profound changes in Mexico's laws, others that will imply also a debate between the political forces. But in the end, I don't believe that that in Mexico, somebody will go and say, it's a bad idea to ratify this agreement. I just don't see that happening.
I don't think the problem's in Mexico.
I don't think that Mexico will be the main problem. In the US, however, and I'll go back to Canada as well, because people tend to forget, and I include myself, forget about that situation over there. But in the US, certainly the fact that we now have a House that is controlled by the Democrats, it poses a challenge.
Yes.
I think that as opposed to what we saw during the negotiations even, the new House is certainly going to hold the administration to a much more deep scrutinize and assessment of what they did. We very likely are going to see more hearings taking place, more officials appearing in Congress as they did previously, as opposed to what they did previously when the House was also controlled by the Republicans. Some people have made the case before me if the Democrats are going to be opposed to the USMCA. Again, I am no fortune teller, I don't know, but what I can probably say is that if we stick to what's been the traditional agenda by the Democrats, that includes labor, environment, the strong disciplines for creation of capacity in order to help displaced workers, anti-corruption and others, well, the new agreement has those features. So other than politics, I don't see how the Democrats could square their criticisms on the agreement when the agreement, to be perfectly honest, when the present agreement has more substance than what any other Democrat president negotiated, right? And in Canada, and I will just conclude with this, in Canada, I also don't see problems in the parliament, but there's just one item that really I would suggest to keep checking against this process, which is the re-election of Prime Minister Trudeau. The Canadians are set to have an election no later than autumn this year, so the longer that discussion regarding the USMCA drags, very likely is also going to have the potential to make the USMCA an item in the re-election campaign of Prime Minister Trudeau.
Nick,
I believe strongly that the Democratic Party, everything you said is right on point about that agreement. That said, I believe the Democrats are going to say no in the House. And they're going to say no because they don't want to give Trump a win. The civility in the United States over the last 2 years is just unbelievably distasteful. It's everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. It's us against them on everything, and I see it to be a real problem. And then you start asking yourself, what's the next step if that doesn't get ratified?
Well, before we get on to what's the next step, like an intermediate step, is it a problem? And it's an indiscreet question, but you were in government, so I think it's valid. The current government's dismantled the team that negotiated USMCA. We've seen over the past 2 months a certain disregard for technical expertise, I think we could say, in the new government. Does the Mexican government have the skill set to go to the Democrats and to lobby effectively in the US to get this agreement through Congress?
I think it does, and well, certainly as you mentioned, and again, it's been widely reported, the new measures on austerity and others regarding resources executed by the new administration have implied that some people that participate in those processes are now in other ventures. No? But I think that the core of the team stayed. There are many civil officers that continued in the ministry. Dr. Luz Maria de la Mora, who is the Undersecretary of Trade Negotiations. She herself also had previous spells at the ministry and also at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So she's fully, she's a very intelligent person. She's fully qualified to run these processes. She's also very technically knowledgeable. So I think that the team is there. Also, I would argue, and I would join with this comment, the fact that it's not only Economía's team, but the Foreign Affairs Ministry. You remember that Dr. Jesus Seade, Ambassador Seade, who participated with us in the later part of the negotiation process in the USMCA, is now Undersecretary for North American Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he's also going to have a major responsibility in this regard.
So they've got the people, but what should they do?
And the support of the private sector as well. You know that in Mexico we have this figure of the cuarto de junto, the room next door, of all the representatives of the private sector that actively participate, the Consejo Coordinador Empresarial, as the head of all that process. And they will continue certainly to make this case in the United States. So I don't see that it's such an important project for Mexico. And I'm daring to say this because the fact that you have the outgoing administration of President Peña joined by the negotiators of the new incoming administration and jointly conducting the last few sessions of that process, to me really what tells is that for us, the NAFTA, USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, whatever you want to call it, was not a partisan project, was not the pet project of someone, but rather it was a matter of national interest.
But then, as you were saying, Nick, what happens if it doesn't get ratified in the US?
I'm not sure.
Uncharted territory.
Well, there are two possible ways there. If it's not ratified, but the current agreement stands, then we go business as usual as the past 20
likely,
plus.
Okay.
No, but the immediate result is that if you have no agreement, you revert back to the existing agreement, right? Legally speaking, I'm not saying that politically.
I thought Trump rescinded NAFTA.
Probably, I agree with that.
And I think because he did that, what I've heard would be the next step is you're going to have to negotiate some sort of short-term, ad hoc, make something happen kind of approach, which sounds fairly unorganized.
It is, such a process will certainly be very unorganized, but even before we get to that point, if let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that, and again, this is just completely hypothetical, I have no information whatsoever on this, but if the new agreement is not ratified in the US, and because of that, then President Trump decides to withdraw from NAFTA 1.0, before any organized process of reorganizing that happens, I see the issue being taken to the Supreme Court in the US, because there will be a cascade of lawsuits against the actions of the executive. And because let's remember that in the US, the actual authority regarding trade lies on Congress, not in the US. So this is something that, well, hopefully we don't get to that point, because if that happens, the effects on the financial markets, the futures, the ability to invest and so on, is going to be hardly hit, even before we are able to do anything.
Juan Carlos talked in his presentation about a slippery slope towards a wider trade war, and we've got deadlines all the time now. We've got the expected decision on the 232 on cars coming up within days probably, and the March the 1st deadline on steel, and obviously next week's fresh talks with China, and the Chinese president coming out this morning saying that China and the US are inseparable. Both do well or both get hurt. Cooperation is the best choice. So how easy do you think it will be to to diffuse these time bombs?
I think what's key is that discussions have been going on for resolution on all these fronts be it the old NAFTA, be it the Chinese. So I guess I feel hopeful that in light of the fact that dialogue is occurring and progress seems to be made. But I will say this, I think the people in the United States, after so many years of bureaucracy and feeling like they were, underwriting the world, and I'll cite to you the situation with NATO. NATO, almost 30 countries, 3 of them pay their fair share, what everybody agreed to pay. The United States is carrying the whole thing. And you start saying, why would I, or anybody in Iowa or Nebraska, why would they want to be paying for everything for Europe on the defense when there's so many other things that don't seem equitable? When this past week, the United States crossed $22 trillion of debt. There's some big issues out there. And to underwrite so many things and to have tariffs on what can be sent to the EU, but really nothing coming back, something's wrong with this picture. But this is something that seems to have been tolerated for a long time. And now we've got, you can call him a bully, you can call him whatever you want to call him, but we've got a president that's saying, hey, wait a minute. I haven't been part of the deep bureaucracy. Some of this stuff doesn't make economic sense. This doesn't seem fair. And I think there's a healthiness that the American people are seeing. But the key is they expect dialogue, and they do expect negotiations. They expect something to be occurring, not just throw these tariffs in and go home. That is protectionism.
What impact, can you talk us through a little bit of the impact on Mexico's auto sector if tariffs on cars are applied?
If tariffs, if Section 232 on cars, and just for the benefit of all of the audience, there is currently an investigation under Section 232, the same one that Nick and I referred to on the steel. There's one open on cars, really on cars. And its report is due by next Monday, I think.
I think it's the weekend, yeah.
So if the report were on the positive, the Department of Commerce recommends President to take action in the way of tariffs, and the President has 90 days, if I recall by heart, on executing or not the recommendation of the report. Now, what happens to Mexico? Nothing. Because under the USMCA, we negotiated a side letter which established that Mexico, up to a certain number, would be excluded from the application of Section 232 on cars. Pickup trucks will be fully excluded, and for cars it was 2.6 million cars. We might debate whether that figure is high enough or not, but just for you to give you an idea, we exported roughly around numbers about 1.8 million cars to the United States. So the fact that we are covered by the whole of our production and still have some room to grow in the next for a few years, then that seems like a good figure to me. Now the larger effect in Mexico certainly, and Canada has the same ledger. But for them, the number is different because Canada doesn't have the same existing capacity and the plans and investments that Mexico does. But the larger effect of that report, if it does come out in the positive, I get that it's been portrayed as a way of gaining leverage, negotiating leverage against some partners, namely Japan and the European Union. But I have yet to see that the Europeans or the Japanese are going to come to the table in those conditions. It is a tool, certainly, but it's a very risky move. If it does bring the Japanese and the Europeans to the table, and as part of that, a new agreement, a new understanding is being struck, then it will be fantastic. If not, we'll be back again on that slippery slope that I referred to.
And even if it does bring them to the table, I mean, as we're seeing with the talks with China, they keep going to the table, but getting an agreement out of the table is what's proving a bit difficult. I just wanted to ask you another question on Mexico that's nothing to do with steel or cars. Tomatoes. That's a new trade war that's just started.
Yeah.
It's a 1.8 billion industry, Mexico's tomato exports. It's huge. I was astonished to discover that a quarter of the value of all tomato exports worldwide comes from Mexico. So it's a big deal. How do you see this particular dispute playing out?
Well, to begin with, again, just for the benefit of the audience, first of all, this demonstrates that the Mexican agricultural sector is very competitive worldwide, is very well recognized worldwide, and that we export many things. So this idea, our farmers are very competitive, let's put it like that. The original tomato fight, it dates back to 1996. Some people in this room have not even been born at that moment. But the Florida producers filed an anti-dumping order against exports of Mexican tomatoes, and the Department of Commerce, the ITC and the Department of Commerce process found a dumping margin of 146%, I think. So at that moment, what is called a suspension agreement was negotiated, under which the Mexican exporters committed themselves to export at particular prices during particular months of the year, so as to make sure that there was no damage. That's the key concept, damage being caused to the Florida producers. So that agreement has been in place in 1996. And it's been renewed every time. But this occasion, and I believe it's only too aligned to the current views regarding trade, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced that it was withdrawing from that agreement. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that the Department of Commerce was under a lot of pressure from the Florida growers, the Florida producers. And again, I keep coming back to the politics, what Florida represents, who is a representative in the Senate for Florida, and so on. But again, the fact that we have that we no longer, in the short term probably, are going to have this agreement implies a tremendous challenge for the industry. The industry certainly would like to see some negotiations ongoing. There's some room for that between now and, well, the agreement finishes in May. So there's also some elapsing time before it is fully de-enforced. So I would say that there's a window between probably late April, early May, down to perhaps late August, early September to negotiate a new deal. I believe that the Mexican exporters will be interested in continuing the agreement, and they will certainly be interested in continuing the negotiations, but it depends on whether the Department of Commerce has the political will to sit down and conduct those negotiations and act as an honest broker. We recently went in also another very fascinating industry, the sugar and fructose industry. We also underwent a similar process about 2 years ago. So under the current administration, Secretary Ross and Secretary Guajardo negotiated that agreement. So yeah, there is a previous reference where in such a very complicated situation, when you had industries that really were not talking to each other, we were able to pull out victory out of thin air and get an agreement. But this time around, obviously, I am hoping for the best because, as you say, it's a substantial amount of money. And for certain states, Sinaloa, Sonora, Baja California, it's a very important means of livelihood for a lot of people. So absent that, we are going to start seeing other problems that we certainly don't want to see.
And could tomatoes be a quid pro quo for getting some sort of concessions in the USMCA?
I don't know, but I remember that there was this little thing called seasonality that was suggested, proposed by the US during the USMCA talks. And I remember that some of the strongest backers of that seasonality clause, which would have limited Mexican fresh produce exports to a certain period of time of the year, I remember the Florida producers being strong backers of that. That's what my memory tells me.
Well, just before we open the floor to questions, I just want to ask you, Nick, with your global hat on, as a British person, Brexit, it's got to be asked, what impact is this going to have on global trade?
I am deeply concerned about how that thing is all falling apart.
You and all of us.
I hope that it doesn't get to a point of just trying to push the UK off as just being irrelevant and you know, not really a player, so it's not going to matter, and you know, you're out of here. So that, I guess, is probably my biggest concern. That they're not really intertwined in it all anymore.
There's many
It doesn't
risks.
matter. Yeah, major risk.
Yeah, major risk. Well, let's open to the floor to questions. Agustin.
I'd like to strenuously disagree on several points. One, I'm a big fan of dumping. I wish BMW would dump cars on me. I think the people giving you or offering you products for less than they cost to produce is not a problem, but actually an opportunity. I invest in real estate in Texas, and right now the buildings are getting more expensive because of steel, and that is real. So if there's no profit motive behind making steel in the United States, then allow a state-owned enterprise under the U.S. military to produce the steel that it needs for its next Nimitz, and let us get on with our job, and don't make everything else more expensive under this guise of national security, which I think is disingenuous. Two, the reason why the United States has subsidized European security is because it has been in its national interest to do so. And that is the post-war order. And to say that the U.S. is somehow a victim of the international trading system, or a victim of NATO, or a victim of all of these things is silly. If there needs to be a renegotiation on those points, then there needs to be a renegotiation on those points because things have changed or whatever. But there's no need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there's no need to humiliate your partners. And I think that's actually what's going on. A lot of it, sure, there might be some basis to it. Some of it, I think it's been overblown. But I think that the biggest problem has been the tone, which is completely unacceptable across the board. Dealing with Mexico, dealing with Canada, dealing with the Europeans. There's a reason why the United States became a superpower, and it is because of us. It is because of the Mexicans, it is because of the Europeans, and it is because of the Canadians. Because we have been fantastic neighbors, and we have been fantastic allies. And that needs to be highlighted, because quite frankly, all of this discussion has gone completely off the rails. And that greatest generation, of which actually my grandfather was a part of, fighting for the United States, would not recognize the attitude of the United States right now. And they would be ashamed, to be frank.
Well, my uncle's still alive, and he was at Guadalcanal, and he recognizes that things need to be changed. And if you go back and you look at the first leader of NATO, General Eisenhower, he made it very clear, this is a short-term situation, short-term. He made that extremely clear. So for you to say now that, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the thing didn't turn out to be a short term, it's turned out to be a long term with the U.S. And to say that Mexico and Canada made U.S. a superpower? Come on. Come on. Well, come on.
So if the United States had not had two neighbors that have been so friendly and so cooperative, the United States, I'll go to the Pentagon. The Pentagon itself has published reports saying that if it really did have to worry about its neighbors, that the U.S. would actually have to come back from its positions overseas, and it could not be a superpower. Now, I mean, at the end of the day, this is an open debate about what it means for the United States and what are U.S. national interests. But let me come back to the point before, and I think you could agree, the fact that there is an issue with the way that this discussion has been handled.
Absolutely, it's disgraceful. The rhetoric is so disappointing.
Any other questions? Mariana.
You mentioned, just to follow up Steve's point, but from another perspective. I mean, it is true that the current WTO doesn't really address the issues that we are living today, right? You know, the fact that China has become a great power, the fact that, China has been, this sort of intervening, and, a lot of state enterprises are participating in the global trade system, etc. But, it is true that in the United States, there is if the United States agree in one thing, is that China has abused the system, right? They might disagree about anything else, but on that point, the United States is agreeing, and even there is an agreement with that with Europe and with Mexico, etc. The point here is, how can we reform the WTO to really address the new reality of China, the new reality that the United States can no longer sort of being the policeman, and also the fact that the WTO is slow in many times responding. So a lot of the disputes are handled, not in the WTO, but with lawyers outside. What should be, in your mind, sort of the letter to Santa Claus for the new global trading system?
I think that was for me, right? I believe that, China certainly is, it's the latest feature of the international trading system that has caused such an impact. I am not going to qualify whether good or bad. There are certainly views on both sides. But I think that China is, if the leadership going all the way from Xi Jinping down to the Minister of MOFCOM and others, the Chinese ambassador Shang in WTO, they could certainly get a lot of goodwill around if they show some commitment to address all of these practices that clearly are not in the best interest, let alone of the international trading system on themselves, because Chinese treasury can only last for so long. So supporting all those companies that are not really making any profits, the environmental consequences of many of those decisions, and quite frankly, the pressure, the social pressure that picking up balls and pockets of development is causing, that should also be on China's own interest to address. If that can be seen in conjunction with how we rewrite the trade notebook, I would probably go on 3-4 points. Right? I have many, but if 3 or 4 points is what Santa can bring to me, I will settle with those. The first one is new disciplines for state-owned enterprises. Those need not to be invented overnight. The TPP and the Usmc already have strong chapters on behavior of state-owned enterprises, so we could hypothetically borrow from that. I would also have a better system of reporting, checking, enforcing, and following up on subsidies, especially for the sub-federal grants, the sub-federal pieces of them, because in China that's really what happens. The subsidies do not necessarily come out of the regime, but rather the several provinces have their own practices as well. Third, I would get China, or I will make China the champion of reforming the dispute settlement procedures. Because at the end of the day, the battle that we're seeing with the appointment of the members of the appellate body and the WTO, and the way that the decisions and the rulings of the WTO have come out recently, all of that is, what's behind all of that is, how do we deal with a system that is not prepared to address those developments? So judges members of the appellate body have come up with their own interpretations, and it varies from case to case to case, right? So I would probably, and because everything at the end of the day has a link back to what this country that starts with C and finishes with A, and it's not Canada, is behaving, well, I would probably take one step forward and make China the champion of that, so as to demonstrate to all of the rest of the countries that they're serious about doing this, and they are serious about contributing to the system, right? And the fourth, I would also have China taking more concrete steps in opening up certain pieces of their legislation, including, well, China is very interested in pursuing and establishing disciplines on investment facilitation, e-commerce, which for China, obviously, given the size of the market, are very important features. So, again, those are, to my view, 4 points right there where China could engage not only in strengthening the multilateral trading system, but also sending signals to the rest of the partners as to how serious they are about making the system better.
I think we have time for possibly one more. Yeah. Oh, sorry. There are two more. This one and this one.
So I have a question. Is there a tiny little, amazing little possibility that the US problems are not actually the world's fault? Because it's kind of odd that every time that Mexico or China or any other country has a problem, we blame it on corruption or internal pressure, or we basically blame it on us. Right? But whenever the US has an economic problem, oh, Mexico has, it's Mexican steel, it's China, it's Canada, it's Europe, and it's kind of funny.
Yeah, I have no comment to that comment.
Good morning. I'm Anna Leroy from White & Case. So I am a trade lover, but I'm definitely not a trade zombie. It's supposed to be a joke about our current administration. So this question is mainly for Juan Carlos, and the other panelists feel free to comment. Now you're on the outside, so you're not on the game anymore. So this is a great opportunity for us who follow you. So what should the new administration be doing in terms of trade? So not just on tomatoes and steel, but we're thinking long term, and we're thinking of maybe having Trump stay for another 4 years. So it's of course, open to the other two panelists as well.
I am no one really to be telling the new administration what to do.
Oh, come on.
But
Go on.
no. But I will rather comment on what I've seen, and obviously those are things that I approve and I believe are important. Was not too long ago, I think it was last week, there was this forum in the Senate about the importance of Europe, right? And certainly Europe, we all, for natural geopolitical reasons, have always in mind the importance of the United States. But I would say that Europe certainly is also a very important partner, a partner that we just concluded the negotiations with them on late spring last year. But that agreement is yet to be signed. And the only reason why it hasn't been signed yet is not because something went wrong with the negotiation or because there's something pending. It's just because in the EU, well, those things take time. When you have 27 countries, so that those things take time. So I've seen the engagement that the new administration has in that process with Europe, and I certainly think that it's a good thing that they are pursuing that. Likewise, the implementation of the CPTPP, what used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now in this new life, it's the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, and it went into force on December the 30th last year. Already fell on this administration, and that agreement has many pieces, many moving pieces that were attached with phase-in moments, namely changes in legislation that need to be done or commitments that will not be enforced until after a certain number of years. So that implies doing extensive work with many industries, and I'm sure that all people here have heard the challenges that the textile industry the footwear industry and others have regarding the TPP, but I think that given all the things that we have spoken, having the TPP is a good idea, because again, we are saying how much or how important it was for the USMCA to be signed, but it's not enforced yet. We are speaking about how Europe can represent another opportunity. Our trade with Europe should be worth probably around $80 billion. Haven't seen the latest figures yet, but it's around ballpark figure $80 billion. But the agreement hasn't been signed yet. What we have right now is TPP. So that represents the opportunity on this trade diversification, and certainly other platforms, no, Alianza Pacifico, it's always there, and it's a good opportunity to continue expanding the links to Latin America. Brazil certainly, I would say that requires a deep thinking on how we want to approach Brazil. There are certain commitments coming up, including trading cars under ACE 55, and obviously that is something that in the context of what we have spoken, it's going to be important. So for what I've seen on the actions trade-wise of the new administration, they are pursuing an agenda that implies diversification, which is pretty smart, an agenda that tries to lessen, to ease the exposure that we have because of other situations, including, well, our neighbors to the north, which is also very smart to do. And the engagement continues at the multilateral level. So that is also something that is, to my view, something very good. And again, the team that is in charge of this, Dr. Graciela Marquez, Dr. Los Variedades de la Mora, could not be better prepared for all of this.
Well, I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much to both Nick and Juan Carlos for a very stimulating debate. Yeah, quite an inflection point, aren't we?
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, there's a lot to play out.
Yes.
Have you seen, Nick, the plant that Nucor is building in Guanajuato?
Yeah.